You're listening to an Ono Media podcast. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Into the Dark podcast. I am your host, Payton Moreland, and I am so happy you are here and getting ready to venture into the dark with me. Now, if you are watching on YouTube and can give this video a thumbs up, turn on notifications so you don't miss any time that I post, and then also leave a comment. It really helps us out. And if you are listening on podcast, hi, and can leave me a review, I would absolutely appreciate it. If not, I am just happy you are here. Thank you for the love. Thank you for the support. Let's get into my 10 seconds. Honestly, you guys, today is just not it. Okay? Today's not it. It's not it. I'm tired. I wish I could stay in bed all day. And I know that there's probably a lot of you listening who resonate with that. But you know what? We got up, we did it. And if you are just laying in bed, you got up and you did it. Okay? That's all we can do. We can just open our eyes and keep going. And, I received like a lot of messages, on my personal Instagram from listeners of Into the Dark, because obviously you guys know that I talk about, my mental state here a lot more than I do over on Murder with My Husband. And I can't let you guys know how much your messages mean and help me. And to know that like we are all just living life together. And I just want everyone listening to know that I love you and that you matter and you are supposed to be here. And I hope that this 45-minute episode or whatever we're about to do is a nice little escape and brings you some peace and joy. And I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm not even going to say sorry for crying. I don't know why I'm emotional. Actually, I know, because today's not it. Today's not it, but you know what? Everything works out for us. Everything works out for me. Everything works out for you. And we are going to have a fun episode diving into this. So let's do it. So the ancient world is full of mysteries. Human beings have been around for hundreds of thousands of years. And when you're looking at history on that scale, the invention of writing came along actually pretty recently. Our written records only go back 10,000 years or so at the most. And I'm oversimplifying a lot, of course, and providing some very broad estimates so far as dates go. But roughly speaking, human culture existed for a long, long time before anyone found a way to write down any details about what was going on that we have found. So there are hundreds of thousands of years on this earth that we really know nothing about. We can make educated guesses based on artifacts, myths, and legends, but some mysteries may never be solved. And we're going to talk about one today, and that is of Stonehenge. Now, when you picture Stonehenge, you probably imagine a bunch of arches made of stone. Those are its most famous features, but there's a lot more to Stonehenge than that. So let's cover its layout first for those of you who don't know the mystery of it. It is basically a very old, like from ancient times, circle of large stones. Like picture a stone tower, like a really large stone standing, and then another one, and then one on top of it. And it's just in a circle, and it's all these huge, tall stones in a circle. That is what Stonehenge is. And it's kind of a mystery because what is it? Why? Who used it? Who built it? What was it used for? It's just something that was built on Earth, and now we all look at it and go, I wonder the history behind that. So it's in southern England, and the nearest town is Salisbury, which sits 9 miles to the south. In fact, the land where the henge starts is called Salisbury Plain. And there are a lot of other henges and other structures in and around Salisbury Plain. So Stonehenge isn't alone. It's one of many mysterious ancient artifacts that were all built roughly around the same time. One is very close to Stonehenge, and it's called Woodhenge. And as you can probably imagine from the name, it's made of wooden posts instead of giant stones. At least it used to be made of wooden posts. Obviously, they didn't last for thousands of years, and today, if you go visit, you'll see replicas that show what Woodhenge used to look like in its day. And I think this is something that is so crazy when you think about the ancient world, is that people were building these huge artifacts. How? How is this happening? And I think that is part of the mystery around these things. So around the time that the very first plow was being invented in England, this was before any kind of written language had even been developed yet in Egypt, a whole lot of people, scientists believe, archaeologists believe, were getting together and throwing a huge party on top of this hill. And the pit is where they threw away their leftovers afterward. Plus, roughly 1,000 years before Stonehenge was even built, and again, these are very rough estimates because the timeline is tricky to nail down, people might have also built another stone circle, like a pre-Stonehenge, but for whatever reason, instead of finishing this other monument, they stopped while it was only halfway built, and they might have actually reused some of its rocks and brought them over to Stonehenge instead. So basically, if you were to look at Salisbury Plain from above, you'd see the land just dotted with dozens of ancient monuments and possible religious sites. Stonehenge is the most famous and probably the most striking one, but all of these ancient structures prove that the land was probably very sacred to the people who lived there and used it. Salisbury Plain was a major site for religion or culture or something. We still don't know exactly why this area was so significant and why the people built all of these in this specific land. Now, if you were to travel to the town of Salisbury, then drive the rest of the way out to Stonehenge, you'd be able to see it from pretty far away because those stone arches are huge. The largest ones are more than 25 feet tall. That's roughly the size of a 2-story house. Don't ask me how back in ancient times they built that and got it to stand that high, okay? Don't ask. But besides the arches themselves, there are also some freestanding rocks which are pretty massive in their own right. So these rocks stand in 2 rings, kind of like a bullseye. There's one small circle of stones in the middle and a bigger horseshoe-shaped row of arches around it. Again, I'm oversimplifying. The inner circle isn't perfectly round by any means. In fact, it's pretty lopsided and it has a mix of arches and freestanding smaller stones. So it's almost like you can't really make sense of it. And also some of the big rocks are tipped over, so that also makes the circular shape pretty messy. Now, the outer horseshoe is a lot more symmetrical and even, but it still isn't perfect. And some archaeologists even wonder if it was always a horseshoe. Maybe it actually used to be a circle too, and a bit of it got knocked down at some point in history. So altogether, all of those stones form what we, the modern people, know as Stonehenge. Now, we have to get into the question. How old is Stonehenge? Nobody really knows exactly when the henge was built. There are a lot of theories out there, many of which are contradictory, and even the experts are constantly updating their opinions and reevaluating their stances as new information and technology comes out. So to make things even more complicated, it also looks like the henge wasn't built at once. Instead, some ancient people might have started building it and then stopped for a few decades or even centuries. And then for reasons we don't entirely understand, the next people started building again and adding more to the henge. And one of those pauses we know lasted a full 500 years, which, think about that, you guys. Think about a group of people starting something, 500 years going by, and then people continuing to add on to it. That is remarkable. That is remarkable, and that is history. And I think when we look at the Stonehenge now with all of the advances in technology we have, we're like, why would they build that? But back then, this was significant to them. I mean, if they were worshiping or this was religious to them, this is what they spent their time on. So it's actually pretty incredible. Now, as near as we can tell, the inside part of the henge, the ones with the smaller stones that don't quite form the perfect circle, that was built first. Then about a half of a millennium later, the outside arches were put up. I will say, the outer ring is the one you probably recognize, and it's very striking. It's hard to imagine this site would have become nearly as famous without the arches that were added 5 centuries after the first circle. We think the oldest parts of the henge might have been put up around 2500 BC. But some experts say construction maybe even began before that. It might have started roughly around the year 3000. So that's 5,000 years ago, which, to put this into perspective for you, that would mean Stonehenge might be almost as old or even older than the very first pyramid that went up in Egypt. Okay, think about that timeline. The henge's last bit of construction was done around 1600 BC, and we don't know why they stopped building at that point or what anyone did with it from that point onward. Frankly, we actually have no written record from that time about Stonehenge. Nobody documented anything at all about it until almost 1500 years later. The very first, very oldest written account we have about Stonehenge is from around 1130 CE, and that's when a historian visited the henge and wrote down a bunch of his thoughts about the mysteries around it, because even back then, they didn't know what it was for. I mean, think about it. These writings are 900 years old, and even way back then, people were like, how did this get built? Where did it come from? What does it do? Now, when I said that Stonehenge started being built around 2500 BC, it's important for you to understand this was before the wheel was invented. So historians and archaeologists have a lot of questions about how the ancient people got these huge, sometimes 20-ton stones to Salisbury Plain, because they weren't formed there. They weren't resting there. This was man-made, huge rocks. And the wheel wasn't even invented yet. This is the mystery around the ancient world. I mean, I think it's important to tell you that the biggest stone weighed a whopping 40 tons. It's about as heavy as a humpback whale. It's almost impossible to imagine how anyone lifted it into an arch, because remember, they placed them on top of each other, one huge stone, and then one across it, or even how it got to the henge in the first place, especially because it's not like the builders were hauling those stones a short distance. Many experts believe that some of them came from a quarry that was 90 miles away. Other rocks might have traveled even further, maybe even more than 100 miles. So these ancient Bronze Age people with no modern technology that we know of, not even a wheel, somehow hauled these incredibly heavy stones almost 100 miles or more. At one time, archaeologists believe that the ancient Britons might have been able to use logs almost like a wheel. The idea was that the builders chopped down trees and then they laid each stone across the trees, which gave them some leverage. And as the logs rolled along, they carried the stones with them. So that's a theory about how they may have moved these. But even with the logs to help them out, it would have taken a lot of people. We're talking about a workforce of about 1,000 laborers. And even with all of those people collaborating, it still would have taken about 10 years total just to transfer the stones to Salisbury Plain. Okay, you guys, that is whoever, the emperor, the priests, whoever wanted this built, this landmark built, saying, yes, but we need to get these rocks to this place to build it. And just that part is going to take 10 years. That's not even counting the time they spent actually putting everything together. So if the ancient people did carry the stones to the henge on logs, this would have been a massive undertaking. A huge number of people had to dedicate years of their lives every single day to moving these rocks around. But here's where it gets complicated. That theory about the logs is actually pretty controversial in the archaeological community. The issue is, there is no hard evidence that the ancient people used logs to haul Stonehenge's stones. There's also no hard evidence to disprove the idea either. People on both sides of the debate are just guessing. Another theory is that the ancient Britons somehow got those incredibly heavy stones onto boats, and that was how they moved them around, although that still raises the question of how they got the stones off the boats and all the way to Salisbury Plain from the shoreline. It's also possible that before they even started working on Stonehenge, the ancient people might have built a bunch of smaller henges. I already mentioned how Woodhenge used to be close to Stonehenge, as well as that other one that was abandoned halfway through. So the thought is that in 3000 or 2500 BC or thereabouts, the Britons built a bunch of little henges. Then for some reason, they took those henges apart and brought the stones from them all together to build one epic structure at Stonehenge. Nobody has any good theories about why they do this or why Stonehenge was so important to them. Another problem is there just aren't enough small henges in the area. Stonehenge is made up of 80 massive rocks, and all of those other old abandoned sites that archaeologists have found didn't have 80 stones total in them. They were just too small. So there are either a lot of ancient henges that we don't know about, or this theory doesn't hold up. The point is, even if we don't know how they did it, we do know that the ancient people put a ton of energy and time into building Stonehenge. We don't know why, because that's a whole separate mystery. I mean, what was it for? One popular idea is that Stonehenge was a very accurate, very elaborate calendar. See, it's believed that the outside circle used to have 30 arches in it. Some have almost certainly tipped over and gone missing over the years. But the thinking is that originally, based on the way they're spaced and laid out, the original design had 30 stones that were upright and another 30 top arch pieces. And it's believed that the ancient people split the year up into months that had 30 days apiece. So essentially the henge would have one stone for every day of the month. Now, other parts of the structure represented different parts of the calendar, like the 4 stones that make up the outer square. They may have been for the 4 years that go between each leap year, which is especially impressive because no other ancient society figured out that leap years existed until thousands of years after Stonehenge was built. And every year during the summer solstice, which is the longest day of the year, the sunrise actually lines up perfectly with the gap in one of the arches. And the same thing is true during the shortest day of the year, the winter solstice. This time, the henge is perfectly in alignment with the sun when it sets. So you might be thinking, that makes sense. Stonehenge was just a way to track the sunrises and sunsets and the movement of the moon and the stars for the ancient people. Except if Stonehenge is supposed to be a calendar, I need to tell you it's not a very good one. The stones and the sun line up great during the summer and winter solstice, but the entire rest of the year, you can't really tell anything about how much time has passed or what day it is. You would basically just have to wait for those 2 days. At least not from the henge itself. Nothing else really lines up in an obvious or straightforward way. Now, in fairness, the sky doesn't always look exactly the same year after year. The stars and the sun line up with Earth differently than they did 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. So some scientists wondered if maybe Stonehenge lined up a little bit better back when it was first built. And then they learned it didn't really. The only time when Stonehenge might have aligned with the stars and the moon was hundreds of years before the earliest possible day that it was even built. So other than during the solstice, the henge has never accurately lined up with the cosmos. And if it's a calendar, it's only actually usable 2 days out of the year, which just doesn't really make sense. And it's obvious that the henge has some other purpose that has nothing to do with timekeeping. We know this because there are also bodies buried among the stones. You heard me right. Almost 60 people were laid to rest in the henge, not near it, but under or next to the arches. And if there's one thing we know about ancient history, it is that burial sites were very important. Now, I mentioned before how Stonehenge might have represented the land of the dead for ancient people, and that theory checks out because at the time it was built, its structures could have been considered the biggest gravestones in all of England. And I think it's also important to note that human beings weren't all that was buried at Stonehenge. There were deer antlers and other animal remains in some of the graves. And I think it is important to tell you that so far as people went, most of their remains were cremated. So all that's left of the deceased is ash. But archaeologists have also found several skeletons buried in the henge, and these included a man whose head was chopped off from behind. From the state of his skeleton, archaeologists think he was executed with a sword, which is a lot of detail to get from bones. And there were also other partial remains, bits of bones and fragments. It was a lot harder to determine how these people died and who they were, but somehow, and I'm not sure how, I'm not an archaeologist, some researchers determined that one of these bodies belonged to someone from Switzerland, meaning they weren't British or from anywhere close to Salisbury Plain. So maybe people were actually traveling from far away to visit the henge even back then, and even visiting to get buried there. Again, it's just hard to say. Historians do think that at least 14 of the bodies at Stonehenge were women and 9 of them were men. Now, it's too difficult to guess the gender for all of the other people, at least with the technology we have now, but the assumption is that these weren't just random individuals, okay? So people believe to end up buried at the henge, they had to probably be very, very important people. Maybe they were spiritual leaders or high-ranking politicians in their time. And some of these, if we're being honest, might have also been human sacrifices. Again, there are a lot of theories, and it's hard to tell which ones are correct. But if Stonehenge was just a calendar or a way to track the passage of time, there would be no need to bury people in it. Clearly, it had some other purpose that fit with these graves, which takes us to it being a religious site. Maybe the ancient people believed there was something magical or powerful about it. We just don't know. I think it's important to mention that there are some pretty strange theories out there around the henge too. For example, some people think that Stonehenge was built by Merlin, literally the wizard who, according to legend, hung out with King Arthur. There actually are folks who believe Merlin was a real historical figure, that he had magic powers, or maybe he was just very good at sleight of hand and other tricks, so people just thought he could cast spells. Now, I mentioned before that some of the oldest records about Stonehenge were written in 1136 CE or sometime around then, and that's when an ancient Roman historian asked some local Brits where the henge came from. Like, what is the legend and what was it used for? And here's what those Brits said at the time. Shortly after Rome first conquered England, so we're thinking roughly around 400 CE, another army invaded the Saxons. The British armies put up a good fight. They used every tool at their disposal to keep the Saxons away. And at one point, a group of British leaders met with some Saxon generals to try and negotiate a truce. But this meeting, according to the Brits, was actually a trap. The Saxons weren't interested in peace, and once they had all of the English warlords and nobles together in one place, they slaughtered them. Now, when the British commoners heard about the betrayal, they were outraged. They rose up against the Saxons and drove them out of their lands once again, and it was actually once and for all. Then they wanted to put up some kind of memorial to honor those British generals who had died, which is where Merlin the wizard comes in. Apparently, he told the Brits exactly where and how to build the memorial, which, as you can guess, is Stonehenge. According to them, he used his magic to steal the massive stones from Ireland, where some giants had been using them in their rituals, because sure, why not? Giants are in Ireland. Merlin took the stones from them, then he plopped them down where they stand now in Salisbury Plain. Now, it's said that Merlin used his magic powers to ensure that the henge would never topple, that it would stand forever as a testament to English resilience and strength, which we know isn't true because some stones have fallen down now. A few have been restored to their original positions, but others are still lying on the ground like a bunch of ruins. Sadly, some even have graffiti carved into them. So even though Stonehenge as a whole is still very impressive and awe-inspiring, it's certainly not magically protected by Merlin himself. Now, on top of that claim, the henge apparently had its own otherworldly powers. The legend goes that as long as those stones were standing upright, people could come to them and be healed if they were sick or injured. Now, that might all sound very hard to believe, but there's actually some historical evidence for this part of the story, or at least a version of it. See, Stonehenge is actually made up of a bunch of different kinds of stone. A lot of the structure is sandstone, but some parts are made of something called bluestones, particularly in the older inner circle. And historically, many people believed bluestone had magical healing properties. Like if someone was sick, a bit of bluestone could make them better. Now, in the medieval era, pilgrims would actually travel all over the world just to be near a bit of bluestone and its healing properties. And maybe ancient Britons felt the same way. Now, the bluestones at Stonehenge are a lot smaller than the sandstone slabs. They're not nearly as impressive to look at. But still, it's believed that the ancient Britons imported those bluestones from 145 miles away. They wouldn't bother to bring those rocks that far unless they were important somehow. And if Stonehenge was supposed to be some kind of magical ancient hospital where people could come and treat their most serious illnesses, and if they believed the bluestone was a key part of the healing, well, then that effort and that distance would be worth it. In fact, maybe Stonehenge didn't represent the world of the dead at all. Instead, it offered a way to keep people living a little longer. It cured people to let them keep going about their lives. I will say some of the bodies that were buried at Stonehenge had evidence of very serious illness or severe injuries, so maybe these were people who came to the site for healing only to succumb to their illnesses anyway. There's one other theory about those bodies, and it is tied back to the Merlin story too. Legend goes that the deceased included King Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon, and the new king who took over after Arthur died. So to summarize, these legends said that Stonehenge was magic and it had numerous ties to King Arthur through his family and his friend Merlin. But of course, there are some problems with that explanation. The biggest one being that we don't know if King Arthur ever actually lived. The legends might be based on a real early British leader, but we can't say for sure. And if he did exist, the time period was all wrong. By the time Arthur may have lived and died, Stonehenge would already have been roughly 3,000 years old. I mean, it was already very ancient and probably incredibly mysterious by that time. But Merlin and King Arthur definitely didn't build the henge for themselves. Now, we have to get into some more modern theories. So there are also allegations that Stonehenge was meant to be a landing strip for alien spaceships. So it didn't just align with the sun so people could keep track of its movements. It was also to make things more convenient for visitors from other planets. Some people have even argued that aliens built Stonehenge for themselves, and that's how these ancient people were even able to lift these stones, and that's because it wasn't them. Because, you know, aliens have their own technology. So the argument is that it's basically impossible for people to have done this at this time. So these extraterrestrials used their advanced machinery to zip all these massive rocks to Salisbury Plain. The idea is if you have the ability to travel to other planets, carrying a 20 or 40 ton stone about 100 miles is nothing. And here's the interesting thing. If aliens did build Stonehenge, they didn't just decide they were done with their work and leave once the construction was finished, because as we know, they would have had to come back and visit it many, many times afterward. Even today, there are a lot of photographs and videos that show strange lights and disc-like objects in the sky above Stonehenge. Sometimes these pictures just show a glowing dot of light. Some of them show multiple objects flying in perfect military formation. A bunch of these pictures even made their way into the UK's official files on unidentified aerial phenomena. Those files with the photos were declassified in the summer of 2013. And they show something that looks an awful lot like a flying saucer hovering right above the arches. I mean, we're used to UFO pictures that are blurry or hard to make out, but these are pretty clear. It's hard to look at these photos and see anything except an alien spaceship at the henge. And again, these pictures came from the official government sources in the United Kingdom. The officials looked at them, realized they couldn't debunk them, classified them, and then eventually released them to the public. Even with all of that evidence, needless to say, this particular theory is not widely accepted. A lot of people just don't believe in visitors from outer space. And even if it's true that flying saucers are visiting the henge today, there isn't any physical proof that they had anything to do with its actual construction. For all we know, they might just be as curious about the Stonehenge as we are. They could be flying all the way over from another solar system just to say, what is that thing? Now, to be clear, even though the henge is very old, people are learning new things about it all of the time. Not too long ago, scientists discovered that Stonehenge is perfectly designed to amplify sound. Meaning if you were on Salisbury Plain and I was standing some distance away and trying to tell you something, you would actually be able to hear me much better if I spoke from inside the henge than if I were outside of it. And if you're in amongst the stones, sounds from the outside are pretty muffled. It literally moves noise from the inside outward and stops distracting sounds from the plane from getting in. So that's a whole new bit of data that suggests all kinds of new theories. Maybe it was meant to be some kind of classroom or gathering space where a speaker could address big crowds from within the stones. I mean, I guess it could have even been some kind of ancient concert venue for all we know. One other theory that's actually gaining momentum is that Stonehenge didn't represent the land of the dead, and it wasn't primarily for healing the living either. Instead, it might have been a sort of metaphorical bridge between the worlds, a place where people could connect with their ancestors who died long ago and close the gap between the past and the present. I don't know if that's true, but the possibilities really are endless. So if there's one thing that I repeated a lot during this episode, it is the words, "we don't know." Again, Stonehenge has been standing for about 5,000 years. And it's not like we recently discovered it and started trying to figure it out. People have known about Stonehenge and been able to go visit it and study it for this entire time, for millennia. It's just that somehow, in the thousands of years that went by, we all forgot what it was for and how it got built. The game of telephone just did not telephone this time. It's the most frustrating kind of mystery. There's no cover-up or hidden group keeping secrets. It's just that we don't know the answers. No one who's alive today does. And the mystery that endures has almost as much staying power as the stones themselves. You guys, I know this was more like a historical episode about the mystery of Stonehenge, but I find it so fascinating that we live on a planet where our ancestors lived and we can know nothing about their lives and what they did. That is so strange, scary, eerie, mysterious, remarkable, and incredible. Like, I just wish so bad that we could just transport back and figure out why and better, how. How did they do this? That would be a feat today. How did they do it back then? I guess we'll never know. I will see you guys next time as we go further into the dark together. Thank you for tuning in. Goodbye.